Hello, everyone, and welcome to Big Rock Moto. Thank you so much for tuning in today. The Honda Africa Twin, with its iconic styling and genuine capability both on and off the road, it is one of the world's most popular, most successful adventure motorcycles. For 2024, Honda have made significant revisions and improvements to both the standard version and the adventure sports version. This standard model, differentiated by its 21-inch front wheel, increased ground clearance, and increased suspension travel versus the adventure sports, gets some meaningful updates for 2024 and is better differentiated as the more off-road oriented Africa Twin. But as my testing is going to show, that's really not the whole story. This adventure sports version, with its smaller and new for 2024 19-inch front wheel, reduced suspension travel, lower seat height, and additional features, albeit at quite a bit higher price, is now differentiated as more of a road touring model. But as my testing is going to show throughout this probably long review video, that may not be the whole story. So today we're going to go over everything that is new for 2024. We're also going to cover in depth and compare and contrast the standard model with the adventure sports model. We're going to ride and review the bikes both on and off road, do all my usual tests. We're going to go super in depth so you can figure out, number one, is an Africa Twin for you in 2024? And number two, if so, what version might be the best? There is a lot to cover today. So with all that, let's get started. All right, as we get started into this review, I have a question for all of you. If you're buying a Honda Africa Twin, are you going to go for the DCT, dual clutch automatic transmission, or are you going to go for a standard shift transmission? Put that down in the comments below and let me know why or why not. I think that'll be an interesting discussion. All right, let's talk about models and pricing real briefly for 2024. And excuse me for having to read off my notes. There's just way too much in this review for me to memorize everything. So in the USA, the 2024 Africa Twin comes in 4 different flavors. You have the standard bike with the manual transmission at $14,799. The standard bike with DCT at $15,599, the adventure sports electronic suspension manual shift at $17,599, and then finally the adventure sports electronic suspension DCT at $18,399. Now in some markets you can get the standard Africa Twin with electronic suspension, but in the US you cannot get that. So let me summarize all of the updates for 2024 for the Africa Twins. So both models benefit from revised engines. They give more low and mid-range torque. Both models get a revised DCT. The settings are revised and improved for better control and low-speed handling, and they've changed the shift points. Both models get a revised and improved 6-axis IMU or inertial measurement unit and electronic settings. For the adventure sports model, you get a new front fairing design. You also get this new smaller 19-inch front wheel and reduced suspension travel, lower seat height, and a little bit less ground clearance. On the adventure sports model, they've also improved the seat foam for better comfort. The standard model, the changes you get here, you now get tubeless wheels, which is great on the standard model, and you get the adjustable windshield. So 2 very, very big improvements there. They also claim that they've revised the fairing a little bit for better wind protection. All right, so let's talk about the specs of the bike, starting with what the specs that they share, and then going in and starting to talk about the differences in specification and features between the standard and the adventure sports. So they both have a 1084cc parallel twin engine. It makes around 101 horsepower, about 82 foot-pounds of torque, or 111 newton meters. On the suspension, they both share a 27-degree rake angle. That's the angle of that front fork. 27 degrees is nice and relaxed, making the handling very predictable and very the opposite of twitchy, very predictable handling, especially off-road in looser terrain like sand and things like that. For servicing, your minor service interval is 8,000 miles or 13,000 kilometers. That's your oil change, basic things like that, setting your chain tension, doing that. Major service interval is going to be 16,000 miles or 26,000 kilometers. That's going to be your valve clearance inspection, which is pretty involved on these because to get to it on a parallel twin, you have to remove a lot of body work in the fuel tank and throttle bodies and all sorts of stuff like that. Now, in terms of maintenance on your air filters, Africa Twins have been this way since they came out in 2016 for the newer generation. The air filters are under these side fairing panels, so you can get to them pretty quickly, but you do have to remove some plastic clips and a few screws, pull the fairing panel off on each side. There's an air filter under each side, and then you can get to your air filter. So not terrible, not the best. At least you don't have to remove the fuel tank like you do on the Transalp. Now, I will say the air intakes are up here under the front fairing, so they're pretty high up and forward out of the dust. If you notice off-road, a lot of the dust is around the rear wheel and the back of the bike, so it stays pretty clean unless you're riding in a really dusty groove. All right, it's important we talk about how these two models differ, and of course we'll go out and do the actual ride tests, how they work in the real world. But in terms of specs, here's the things I want you to know. So we covered pricing real quickly. The base model is $14,799 standard transmission, and the Adventure Sports is $17,599 standard transmission. All right, so what is that? A difference of $15, $16, about $2,800 to go up to the Adventure Sports. Wheel sizes, so the standard has 21/18, and the Adventure Sports has a 19 front and an 18 rear. I do like that 18-inch rear that the Africa Twins have. Gives these bikes a little more ground clearance and better tire choices for off-road tires. The seat height, so the standard bike, and the seats are adjustable low and high. I'm going to quote you the low positions. The seat height on the standard bike in the low position is 33.5 inch or 850 mil. The Adventure Sports is 32.9 inches or 835 millimeters. It feels like, I know it doesn't sound like much of a difference. When you actually sit on the bikes, it feels more dramatic than that for whatever reason. All right, so the weight difference between the bikes is about 25 pounds. Your standard model is 510 pounds or 231 kilos. The Adventure Sports is 535 pounds or 242 kilos. Now, if you add the dual clutch transmission, that adds around 10 kilos or around 23 pounds. Fuel capacity is also very different. So smaller fuel take on the standard bike, you've got 5 gallons or 19 liters. On the Adventure Sports, you have 6.5 gallons or about 25 liters. The difference in fuel range is about, the bikes get around 50 miles a gallon, so you get an extra about 75 miles of fuel range out of the Adventure Sports. So real world, 200 miles easily on the standard bike, 275 miles easily on the Adventure Sports. Ground clearance. So probably you're not doing hard enduro on your adventure bike, at least I hope you aren't, but you do get a little more ground clearance on the standard bike, 9.8 inches or 250 millimeter, down to 8.7 inches or 220 millimeter on the Adventure Sports. It makes sense, smaller wheel, lower suspension travel, the bike sits lower. Speaking of suspension travel, it's important to know this. So the standard bike has 9 inches front or 230 millimeter and 8.7 inches back or 220 millimeters. The Adventure Sports takes out a little bit, but not too much. So you go down to 8.3 or 210 in the front and 7.9 or 200 in the back. So the idea that Honda has, and I think they're right, and we'll show this in the review, is lower the bike down, get that seat height lower, lower the center of gravity, improve the handling, make it easier to reach the ground, give you better handling on the pavement, and then off-road, well, you'll just have to wait and see. The extra features that you get on the Adventure Sports version, so there are some key extra things that you can't just add to the standard bike. You get these cornering headlamps, which work really, really well. I have tested those. You get heated grips, which is really nice. And because in the US you can't get electronic suspension on that bike, it comes standard. You're forced into electronic suspension if you get the Adventure Sports. And you cannot get that on the standard bike here in the US. And we'll talk about why I like the electronic suspension so much as we go start riding. All right, let me take you on a quick walk around and show you the features of each model, being as brief as I can, because I know this is already a long video. So if you look at the fronts on the bikes, you can see, you get these extra cornering lamps here on the Adventure Sports, and you don't get that on the standard model. Also, notice, well, it's hard to see from here, but see how much wider the fairing is on that bike versus the standard bike? It's a pretty big difference. The windshield also taller on the Adventure Sports, but now you do get that nice adjustable screen on the standard model as well. Then, of course, our wheels and tires. So you get a 19-inch front wheel now on this one, and it's wider. It's a 110 as opposed to a 90/90/21 over there on that bike. They're both spoke tubeless wheels. And of course, this has the gold rims because that's this color package. Africa Twins have really nice brakes. Nissan calipers, 4-piston. on each side. They work very, very well. The skid plates are pretty good coverage, but they're pretty thin. So it's something you want to upgrade if you're doing a lot of off-road riding. You can see the dual clutch. If you get the dual clutch, you get this whole thing here. You might want to get something to protect. Well, I'm telling you, if you do off-road, get a bar to like protect this. This really sticks out. The other side of the engine sticks out too. Foot pegs, exhaust. I'm in the studio because it's 103 degrees outside, so I'm a little bit cramped here. The seat is a little different on the Adventure Sports than the standard one. Of course, bigger fuel tank. The handguards that come on the bikes, you can see on both bikes where I did the drop test, they're not broken, but they pop out of these little plastic things. They're really chintzy, so you're going to need to upgrade those. The mirrors are fine. Turn signals are LED, so that's nice. What else? Got your radiators up under there. Is there anything else I want to show you in the Adventure Sports? Well, let me come over to the standard one and cover that. So you can see, a little bit different skid plate setup with this one. You can see that bigger front wheel, same brakes, and then a little bit more ground clearance, of course, on the standard bike. Coming to the back, you can see the rear fender assemblies, LED lighting in the back as well with LED turn signals. You get nice grab handles on either one, so nice place to hold on, or a small cargo rack to strap a few things. Okay, jumping into the cockpit, we'll do the Adventure Sports version. Of course, you DCT, so you have a parking brake. Your switch cluster here, I have a separate video that I'm putting out, instructional video on how to use the Africa Twin electronics. I don't want to get into too much of that now because there's so much to cover. Once you learn how to use all of the switch gear and the computer system on the Africa Twin, it's great, it's powerful, fully featured. You just have to spend the time in learning how to use this thing. It can be a little intimidating at first. You've got all sorts of switches for all your controls. You have the DCT buttons as well. You have a horn button and a turn signal. Over here, because I've got DCT, this is our drive switch, automatic manual switch, and sport mode switch. Cruise controls over here. I don't love that because I just think it's easier. I mean, the reason they didn't put it over here because I ran out of room, but it's a little easier to have cruise control buttons when you have it over here. Your keys centrally located. The reason that these Africa Twins have two dashes is because, first of all, it takes a minute for this upper one to boot up, but also these have Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, which you have to connect. You have to connect the USB to your phone, and you have to pair to a headset. Once you do that, you can have Android and Apple up on your screen for navigation or apps or music or whatever you want to do, phone calls. So you get this lower dash in addition to that. But all of your technical information about your power modes, your traction control, ABS settings, trip computer is going to be all up in the upper TFT, which is a touchscreen, and it's very, very nice. Now you have riding modes. So the bike comes with tour, urban, gravel, off-road, and then 2 user modes. You can configure how you want the user modes. You can really set them up how you want. I set up user 1 for off-road and user 2 for on-road with my preferred settings, and I really, really like having that. You have a bunch of trip computer information you can scroll through, and then you have controls here as well for your Honda torque control, HSTC, which is just traction control, the wheelie control, preload, which has 4 different settings, and then the G mode switch for the DCT. So you can do all that. Then you have, it'll show you, you've got all these charts here and by the way, I have it in a gold display level. And in my other video, I show you how to do that. You want to put all of the ride modes into the gold display so you can see all the information. You've got the throttle response, which they call power. So from sharp to soft, but the same horsepower though. Engine braking level, traction control level, gravel mode switch, ABS mode, and then your suspension damping. And then the preload is indicated over here under menu number 4. There's a lot here, and I have a whole 30-minute video just how to use this, so you can check that out if that's something you're interested in. But I'll just say this, a lot of people ride these bikes, and I've made this mistake in the past where you get on it and you're like, oh, it's so confusing, I can't figure it out, it's not intuitive. Give it some time, read the manual, learn how to use it, and it's incredibly full-featured, works really well, and gives you a lot of control over so many aspects of how the bike works. And I really, really like it. And then, of course, you have your windshield adjustment here, which, because I'm holding the camera, illustrates my exact point. And reason I don't like it is because you can't do it with one hand. So if you want to do it while riding, what you end up doing is setting the cruise control, taking both hands off the bars, reaching up here to do it. And I just think that's really dangerous. People are going to do that because you need to adjust it while you're riding. I don't know why Honda doesn't give us a one-handed adjuster. That'd be such a nice improvement. I like the adjustable windshield, don't get me wrong, but I just don't like the fact that you have to use two hands to do it. Now you also get this shade that goes over the TFT, which is really, really nice. One thing I really appreciate about these Africa Twins is because they have a lower compression engine, you can run them on, come on, what are we doing here? Good old California gas nozzles. You can run them on regular 87 octane. So if you're traveling in countries that may don't have premium, or if you just want to save some money, it's really, really nice. I mean, you know, that's a nice thing to have. Whereas so many modern bikes, you need premium gas. The Africa Twins, you don't have to do that. All right, the standard model. Let's take this thing for its test loop. So I'm going to do the same exact test loop with this bike as I do on the Adventure Sports to be a nice, good side-by-side comparison. All right, so we'll start with the highway. So I've got my windshield up. I like to have the adjustable windshield now on this base model. It makes a huge difference in the wind protection. And then I'm going to run in tour mode, which gives you a sharper throttle response. But usually when I ride in urban, which gives you a little bit more gentle throttle response. On this bike, because you don't have electronic suspension or DCT, there's not much to play with here in terms of the electronics. Really, you can play with your ABS setting, your traction control, your engine braking, and your Honda calls it power, but it's really just throttle response. It doesn't change the power of the bike. So let's go back to tour. They changed the exhaust as well, so the engine is revised, the exhaust is also revised, and it has a much nicer sound now, and I really appreciate that. The Africa Twin is pretty quick. The acceleration is very punchy. You know, 100 horsepower is a nice amount of power, and the torque is very, very strong. So riding this bike on the highway, so let me get up to a little bit more speed. So it's a pretty comfortable place to be, even at 70 miles an hour. Let's go 80 miles an hour. My helmet does have some buffeting and vibration on I'm wearing the Arai XD5 dual sport helmet with a peak. There is some vibration and buffeting, but it's not bad. Like it's tolerable. The windshield's a little narrow here, so you do get a little wind kind of coming through the side here. They did revise the fairing and of course the new windshield on the 2024 for the base model. The engine is a very low RPM. It's geared very tall, so even at high speeds you don't feel like you're working the engine very hard. It has very long legs, you know, so it's a good highway cruiser bike. It's easy to get going fast on these Africa Twins because there's so much torque. The engine's smooth, it's got that tall gearing, so it's easy to kind of let your speed get away from you. Overall, the bike is super comfortable. Now, the seat is not really comfortable over a long term. You don't notice it on a shorter ride, but it's not comfortable for longer rides. The Adventure Sports is better. All right, let's do drop and lift on the standard base model. You know, these factory handguards are super weak. I think I almost broke them last time I did this. And then you have to worry about your tank and your fairing. It's not the most crash-worthy bike in stock form. Like the engine's a bit vulnerable, the fairing and radiator's a bit vulnerable. You know, you got to get some real handguards. And it is a heavy bike and, you know, rather difficult to lift. So let me go ahead and as gently as I can, kind of lay it down. Oh man, hurts my back just putting it down. So you can see it's a pretty flat bike and it's rather difficult. So this gives you a good view of our skid plate and suspension linkage and stuff. The factory skid plate is decent, but I would upgrade that if it was me. So the bike is kind of resting a lot on the handguard, which is about to break. So let's go ahead and try to lift it. Oh man, this sucks. Oh, okay. It's really heavy and difficult to lift. We'll do this with the Adventure Sports version and see if that one is any better. All right, let's do the off-road loop on the standard bike. So on this one, again, you don't have as many settings to play with. So your suspension is manual adjustment. I found over the past month of testing it that I like about 2 or 3 clicks out on my compression damping front and back. And then I have the preload in the back up a little bit higher than standard. Try to get that sag more into line. Suspension responds really well to adjustability, the Showa suspension, although it's obviously not as convenient as the electronic suspension version, which is what I would personally get if it was me, if I was buying one, because it's so much easier to do it right through the dashboard with a few clicks. In terms of the setup in your modes, you can configure user 1 and 2 how you want. A lot of people do user 1 for their road mode and user 2 for their off-road mode. I mean, in this one, the only thing that you can program in there is your throttle response, your engine brake, and your ABS settings. So I kind of have user 2 set up for that. But again, for this test, we'll use the pre-programmed off-road mode, which kind of softens the throttle response, gives you a lot of engine braking. The traction control is separate from the ride modes. So you just hit the star button here and you can change your traction control. I like to run in the pie chart 3, 2, or 1 on the pie chart. The traction control is very inconsistent, and I'm going to talk about that. It doesn't respond consistently, and that's one of my chief complaints about the electronics setup on this bike. So anyway, I'm going to start in for this video, let's start in about 4, which is about sort of like a gravel or dirt road setting, 4 bars on the little pie chart here. And then ABS, so the off-road ABS system on this bike, how it works is that you have on-road ABS, which is very sensitive. You have off-road ABS, which leaves the ABS on both wheels, but it reduces the sensitivity, and you can stop the bike quite well with the off-road ABS. It lets you lock just a little bit, and in a dirt, I actually find it quite effective. So I rarely actually turn the rear off. To turn the rear ABS off, you've got to go over to number 4 here on your screen, and then hit ABS rear cancel, hit yes. Now the problem is if you reset, if you turn the bike off, of course that's going to reset, which is super frustrating. I don't know why it does that, because a lot of other bikes will save your ABS setting when you cancel the rear ABS. It'll save that. The Africa Twin does not do that, so that's super frustrating to me. Also, if you turn traction control, it'll save the setting unless you turn traction control completely off. See, you can also, I have the star button set to that, but you can also do it right here. Honda selectable torque control is what they call it. You have wheelie control as well. The wheelie control is part of the problem, I think, because it's part of the traction control system, and if it thinks the front's lifting, it'll just cut the power, and you'll just be like, ugh, and it'll just kind of start to die. That could be part of the problem, so I find turning that off when you're off-road can help with the traction control to be more consistent. But then, of course, you have to, it's going to reset that if you key the bike. So a lot of us on this bike, if we're stopped for just a few minutes, we'll just leave the key on so we don't lose our settings if we have that kind of stuff. So I'm going to turn the ABS back on to demonstrate that because the off-road ABS works pretty well on this. So. All right, I know that's a lot of talk, but there's a lot to go over. So now let's go ride. Oh, one more thing. I'm going to put this down. All right, so You know, the Africa Twins, these are 500 plus pound, 200, 230, 240 kilogram motorcycles. So you have to respect when you ride them off-road. Riding the standard model off-road, you do have that extra suspension travel versus the adventure sports. But as I'll show in the other clip, I don't really find that I can ride this much faster, even despite that. So anyway, things are not always what they seem. The suspension, like I said, it's pretty. Actually, the suspension on the Africa Twin is quite good. You have a good range of adjustment. It does very well coping with big bumps and rocks and things like that. You can definitely overwhelm the suspension, of course, which is true of all these big adventure bikes, because the springs, ultimately the springs are still a little bit soft because they have to do that to make it ride well, so you can bottom it out. The position for standing is quite good and comfortable, though I would fit larger foot pegs for sure, and these bars need to rotate forward a little bit for me. Let me try to turn wheelie control off. So what I got to do is hold this down. Yeah, I think that's the so that's one bar. Let's go to 3 bars. Yeah, anything from like 4 bars down to 1 bar is pretty useful on the traction control, assuming you turn off the wheelie control. The wheelie control ruins it, so you got to turn that off. Woo! Yeah, the Africa Twin, once you get in the zone, it's a blast to ride. You off-road. Woo! This is a great engine for an adventure bike, big parallel twin. So yeah, once you get that wheelie control turned off, you're gonna be happy then with the traction control. It's just that really messes it up. So something that a lot of people don't realize. Now let's talk about the off-road ABS. So that's a full panic stop with the off-road ABS mode, and you can see, let me just do it with a rear brake now. So that's rear brake jammed on. Like what it's doing is it's like lock release, lock release, lock release. So it still stops you pretty well, but it doesn't let you do a full slide. If I want to turn ABS off, what I have to do is go here, cancel, yes, okay, now. So see, now my rear ABS is off and I can slide the rear end around. A couple more things I'll say about the bike. The 27-degree rake makes it very stable and easy, predictable to ride. So unlike the Tiger 900 or even the GS to some degree, it doesn't have that twitchy front end at all. It's very stable and planted. Even with these crappy kind of road tires that it has, well, not crappy, but these are road biased Michelin tires. It's still, even if you hit some sand or dirt or deep, gravel or something, it's very predictable. It's a very nice, stable. I trust the front end, and that's a huge, huge advantage of this bike. I really do like that. This bike really helps if you stand up. If you sit down, the suspension, it has to do more work. So standing up really helps. You're going to have to dial in your suspension settings if you have this bike, which you can do with the clickers. You got to get things figured out with your electronics and your suspension. If it was my bike, I'd have the suspension resprung and revalved for my weight. I think that would be transformational. The African's very good off-road. Really is very, very good. Up there with the best adventure bikes for off-roading. But you have to learn how to use it. It is heavy. It does have a heavy ride feel, just like you get with a big GS or a big Tiger or the any of the big 500+ pound bikes. It doesn't really have the lighter ride feel of a Touareg or an 890. It doesn't, unfortunately. So it's really in that bigger class of bikes, in my opinion, not in that mid-size adventure bike class in terms of how it feels off-road. And then it's top heavy. Once you get it leaned over a bit like that, you lose your footing. It's very easy to drop the bike. All right, so excuse the noise of the cooling fan running, but let's say you want to do a little bit of stupid stuff off-road on your Africa Twin. How is it going to react? So most people will not take their 500-pound adventure bike on a trail like that, but I just want to demonstrate kind of some methods to approach this and how the Africa Twin is in this kind of situation. So with these tires, this is really inappropriate terrain and pretty sketchy. The film just doesn't show how rocky and steep and rutted out this track is. This is not a road at all. So it's actual off-road, right? Instead of just gravel roads that everybody always says. So the off-road mode, the ABS I do have off to the rear. Wheelie control is off because that interferes with the traction control, as I've shown. And then learn to use your traction control as your friend. On these modern bikes like this and the Desert X and the GS and the KTMs, it's your best friend in this kind of thing because it could prevent the bike from just going completely sideways and just, doing a huge slide and going out of control. It can really save your bacon. So I'm going to start with number 4 and see how that feels. It should help me control the bike in this really loose rocks and everything. And if it's interfering, all I do is got to hit a button to turn it down or even turn it off if I want. But that's my advice. Learn to use your traction control as your best friend. All the older guys just say, "Oh, you got to turn that stuff off." No, that's wrong. Sorry. Okay, hopefully this is going to be kind of messy and kind of ugly, so just forgive me for that. First, we got to somehow, I'm going to stay up on this high part, and then I got to drop down into that rut. Whoa! Okay. Oh shit. Okay, so I lost my momentum, so I can either go up here on the left and stay high, or I can stay in this rut. Let's do this. Yeah, the traction control I think is helping me quite a bit. Whoa! Holy crap. Okay. Whew. I told you this was gonna be ugly. Oh shit. Yeah, well, just gonna have to. This is the reality of adventure biking sometimes when you get in over your head. So the mistake was, first of all, I don't have the right tire. Second of all, I should have stayed up here on the high line, stayed out of all this crap. That was a big mistake. Okay, so for this situation, what I need to do is get the bike upright and then just ride out of this rut. So I'm going to put a couple rocks under the tire here to help us a little bit. Adventure bikes are really too heavy and too big for this kind of terrain unless you're an expert, and even then it's hard. So whether it's an Africa Twin or a GS or a Tiger or whatever, they're all too heavy when you get into stuff like this. They're all too big and heavy and to become a real liability. The Africa Twin is a little bit top heavy, which makes things a little bit worse, but all adventure bikes are pigs off-road. So they all kind of suck in this kind of situation.
what I'm doing is I got the bike pretty good and stuck in here in this hole. Now I can't get out, and I'm not really physically strong enough to lift a 510-pound motorcycle up out of this by myself. So this is where you get into trouble on the adventure bikes, right? Because so I eventually got out of this hole down here. I had to drag the bike sideways and then just do a ton of tire spin, just shooting rocks everywhere, get up through here, and now I got it up here where I can, you know, it's reasonable and I can take off again. So you know, a tire like this, it just doesn't have the grip to really give you traction to get you out of a bad situation. And then, you know, on the Africa Twin specifically, like, you know, you can see where I scratched up the engine case here. Like, this is really vulnerable, and I was like dragging it through rocks. So if I had one of these bikes, I'd probably look for some sort of an engine protection thing to prevent it, because I worry about getting a hole in the side of the engine. It really sticks out pretty far. Of course, that's very vulnerable. The handguard is kind of just loose, not really broken. And then I'm gonna kind of publish that as just a separate little video of about, you know, when test rides go wrong or something, because that was not supposed to be part of the Africa Twin official review. I just shouldn't be here on this bike with these tires and this hot condition without any friends and on a trail that's more for an enduro bike. So everything about this is wrong, but I do want to show that you can get through it. But man, you're going to get a physical workout. And any big adventure bike that I take through here is probably, the same thing would have happened. Okay, let's do a little sporty riding on the standard model here. So I'm going to use the pre-programmed tour mode, which gives us a sharper throttle response. Got everything else kind of set up for road, traction control, stuff like that. So let's try to talk about the handling, the brakes, the power, and all those sorts of things. You! Damn it! Woo! Okay, so the Africa Twin, really punchy, powerful motor. The increase in low and mid-range torque is very noticeable on the 2024, so that's one thing. The suspension is, well, it's adjustable, so you can make it firmer for road, which you probably should if you ride mostly on the road. It's not bad. The brake dive is pretty well controlled for such long travel. The suspension works pretty well for a big adventure bike with this much travel. The handling, so the handling is okay. It's not amazing, but it's okay. So the 27-degree rake makes this bike super stable in the off-road situations, makes it a little bit slower steering on the road. So you kind of have to, you know, give it a bit more leverage to get through the corners, but it still handles well, and I think most people will be impressed by it. It doesn't pull off the magic trick of like the Ducati Desert X, where somehow it's amazing handling on the road and still stable off-road. Doesn't quite pull that off, but it's very good. It feels pretty agile. It just takes a little more steering input, which I think is fine. Of course, that's going to depend on also on the tires you have. If we talk about like the brakes, man, this thing has so much torque. The brakes are really exceptional. They're very strong and have a very good feel. Woo! Great brakes, great motor. The other thing I'll point out, you know, they've given it a little more exhaust sound for 2024. Like, I mean, I would not be looking for an aftermarket exhaust on this bike. It has a nice throaty growl to it, and I think it sounds better than the previous version. They did mention that they changed the exhaust for the new bike, and yeah, it worked out really well. So I like most things about it. Really nothing to really complain about here. It does heat up your legs. Your legs do get hot on this bike. It does have that problem. Let's do a little bit of acceleration here. Threshold braking. Yeah, brakes are excellent. I mean, you're limited by traction of the tires. That was ABS engaging, both front and back. Huge believer in ABS, by the way. Saved so many lives. The traction control was kicking in pretty strong in first gear. It has so much torque that, yeah, in first gear when you go hard on the throttle, the traction control is working there to prevent you from wheeling. I do have wheelie control kind of turned down to 1, but it's still on, so it won't let the front end really come up very much at all. And it works with the traction control to do that. You can adjust that, or you can turn that off. You can also adjust your traction control settings as well. Overall, it's really a nice machine to ride on the street. Now, when we ride the Adventure Sports model, which we'll do in a minute, the handling is better on that version. So this does not handle as good as the lower Adventure Sports with that 19-inch front wheel. Oh, I was gonna say the bike, I would, if this was my bike, the first thing I would do would be to get the Honda quick shifter for it. The quick shifter is very, very good. I had it on my last Africa Twin that I owned. That'd be the first upgrade I'd do. Get the quick shifter. The transmission as it is shifts very well, but this bike really benefits from a quick shifter, and you're gonna have a lot more fun if you have that. 10. All right, let's ride the Adventure Sports model on the highway. What I notice jumping on the Adventure Sports is I notice the lower seat height. It feels less top heavy, a little bit, even though it should be more top heavy because it's got all this bigger tank and bigger fairing. Don't underestimate the importance of that lower bike. It makes all the difference. I do notice the bigger fairing, the bigger windshield. There just seems to be more up here because there is. On the dual clutch, I like to use, so they fixed the D mode for 2024. The D mode now works really well, unlike before where it kind of bogged down and put the bike in too high of a gear. But I still like to use Sport 1 or Sport 2 in most of my riding. See, nobody's going to beat this bike off the line, because without having to shift and use a clutch, you can just rock it away from a stop like a crazy person, because the bike's doing all the shifting for you. Now, what do I notice riding the Adventure Sports? The wind protection is significantly better because this is wider and this is wider and taller. I do have, oh man, this truck. I do have a lot better wind protection on this bike. And then the handling, it turns in faster. It feels more nimble. It has a much different feel on the road. A better feel than the standard bike does. I mean, we have the smaller front wheel, we have the lower center of gravity, the bike's lower to the ground, so that improves the handling. We have the wider front tire for more grip. So yeah, it should handle better, and it does. It feels more natural, unlike the bike with the 21-inch front wheel where you kind of have to force it into the turns a bit more. This doesn't really have that feeling. A huge advantage of the electronic suspension is when I want to have a soft, floaty Cadillac ride, I can do that. I can use the pre-programmed modes, like the urban mode or the gravel mode if I want really soft, which are pre-programmed, or I can set up my user modes how I want with firmer or stiffer damping. So like right now, with the soft suspension damping, the ride is just really floaty and cushy. But then if I go into tour mode, immediately the electronic suspension firms up and I start to feel all the little bumps in the road. But if I want to ride aggressively and fast, I have that better suspension damping and that firmer, sportier feel. So it's like having 2 or 3 suspension setups in one bike. It's like, you know, going to your suspension tuner to set up your bike. but now you can do it by clicking a button depending on where you're riding and if you want a soft or a firm ride. So I really like electronic suspension, if you can't tell. I think it's a huge benefit on an adventure bike. Okay, I'm in the exact same spot as I did with the other bike. Let's do the drop and lift test on the Adventure Sports. Being careful not to mess up Honda's very beautiful new Africa Twin. So very gently try to lay this down. Yeah, those handguards are a real issue. Kind of falls the same way as the other bike does. Take a look at the skid plate and everything under here. All right, I feel bad putting this bike on the ground like that. Let's lift it up and see if it's any better than the other one. Okay. Actually, I feel like that was maybe like 20% easier. So it's funny, even though it's a heavier, jeez, friggin' thing. Even though it's a heavier bike, it's easier to lift. Maybe because it's just a lower center of gravity? I don't really know. You know, I guess that's, sometimes things are not as you would expect. Let's just use the off-road mode. So the suspension, you know, of course you can tune things how you want, and then the user mode you can really change it. Where's my preload set to? Okay, that's what I like. Preload, rider plus luggage. I just tend to like that setting. Brings up the rear just a little bit. Of course, in the user mode you can change that. Now, okay, ABS off-road, gravel mode, active. Okay, that's fine. We'll use that. I don't find the G mode on the DCT, which makes the clutch lock up faster. I don't find it makes a huge difference, but we'll go with that. Oh, I do need to do one thing. I need to turn wheelie control off, because that really, as we found, really interferes with the traction control. And then I'll use traction control maybe number 3, and we'll see how that is. And then for the DCT, let me start up. For the DCT, I mean, it depends on the situations you're in. Drive mode is a little bit, keeps it in maybe too low of a gear, so I like to use like Sport 1 or Sport 2. And a lot of times in a dirt, I'll just use the manual shifters to control my gears. But let me show you how it is with the automatic. See, it holds your gears pretty good. It holds your gears pretty good in the sport modes. And remember, the bike has sensors to know what's going on, and that helps control the dual clutch. So what I'm feeling with the suspension, I mean, in the mode I'm in right now, which is the off-road suspension damping, it definitely feels a lot more compliant, a lot softer. It gives a really smooth ride and really absorbs all the rocks and rough terrain pretty well at a moderate speed. Now, if you go too fast, you overwhelm the suspension. But at the pace that most, adventure type people are going to ride, it does an excellent job. And the great thing is, if you want it to be firmer, you just have to click a couple buttons. You want to change the preload, just click a couple buttons. It responds really well to the adjustments. I played with it a lot. I've ridden this bike a lot off-road, and I found that kind of the medium suspension damping in the user settings kind of worked best for me. I found this off-road setting to be, it almost opens the damping valves a little bit too much, which gives you a nice soft ride, but I like a little firmer, so I was using the user modes and using like moderate suspension damping. And then what I did was I felt like the back was too soft in relation to the front, so in my user mode I set it up where I put harder suspension damping at the back and softer at the front. You can do that when you go into the settings for the user suspension mode. So again, really cool that you can tweak all this with a click of a few buttons. That's why I think electronic suspension is so amazing for an adventure bike, where you're doing different terrain and different riding styles, carrying different loads. You just click a button and you can adjust for how you need to, what you need to do. Okay, actually the handling, you know, it's funny. I don't know how to say this, but I just think this bike just feels like it handles better than the standard model at these moderate speeds. I feel like it turns a little bit easier. I feel like it's a little less top heavy feeling. It's kind of surprising because it's supposed to be the more road option, the more highway oriented option, but it doesn't really, you know, seem to be the case. And of course, with the DCT, it's just one less thing for me to have to do. I can really focus on my line selection, my throttle, and my brake, and I'm not dealing with, you know, getting my foot into place to shift the gears and all that crap. So I can focus more on the stuff that really helps me ride better instead of the shifting. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm really riding slower or faster on this, but this feels better than the standard bike to me. The DCT does a surprisingly good job of keeping you somehow in the right gear almost all the time. Woo! So here's the deal. I feel like with the standard model, maybe there's more headroom to ride a little bit faster with that bigger suspension travel. Like if you really want to rally it hard. But at more moderate speeds, I'm telling you, I honestly feel like the Adventure Sports works better. It just feels better balanced. And it feels lighter to me, and it feels like it handles better. And I like the suspension better on this. Because you have such a huge range of adjustment right at your fingertips. So, I don't know. I really, really like this. Off-road ABS works really well, as we've talked about. I mean, because the suspension is, you know, dynamic and it's sensing things, it can kind of firm up when it needs to. I'm a huge fan of the Showa electronic suspension. I think it's absolutely worth the money. I mean, the combination, so here's the thing. On this model, the combination of the electronic suspension, the dual clutch transmission, and then once you figure out how to use your traction control and everything, like you can really yeah, it's kind of like cheating. You can really haul ass on this thing and just kind of sit down and haul ass, because it kind of does so much for you. Standing up feels just fine as well. Yeah. I mean, I'm really enjoying this. This is awesome. I love this bike. I really, really do love it. I mean, yeah, this thing is so dialed in. This is the best Africa Twin that I've ever tested. All right, let's do this little enduro section again, but on the Adventure Sports. You know, the main story here is going to be, does the DCT help or hurt us? Now, for something like this where it's super slow and technical, like this is an enduro bike trail, it's not for adventure bikes at all. This is stupid, and yesterday I really got messed up in here. I like to use a manual mode because I don't need to be in second gear at all on this, so I just manually put it in first gear. and then I can enjoy the benefit of sort of the feeding in the power really easily. And then I'm using traction control, and I can switch that when I want. So let's go and kind of see how this is. And today I'll try to take the right line, hopefully. Ah! Yeah, see, this is really not the best place to take an adventure bike, honestly. Wow. Ah, shit. Okay, take a break. I'm basically just on a cliff. I tried to go up here. Okay, so what I was finding was, so it's kind of good and bad with the DCT as I sit here almost vertical. So when you're feeding into power, when you have a clutch, you can you have that manual clutch control, and you can pop into the power, you can pop stuff over. So there's a reason that dirt bikes have clutches and enduro riders use clutches, not automatics. Now, it was helping, in a way it was helping because I could very slowly modulate the power just through the throttle instead of having to clutch it. But I think it was also a hindrance because I don't have that full sort of manual control with the clutch. And I was having trouble kind of getting momentum there with the DCT. Now, I could have helped by turning the traction control off. That was also kind of part of my problem. I need to turn that down. We'll just go ahead and turn that off for now. We hold this down, and then it should, no, I guess we have to hold it down here. Okay, now it's off. Okay, now I got to figure out, okay, I'm in this rut, so I guess I need to kind of slide the bike. Whoa, okay. Now what I have to do, so yesterday I got stuck in that and dropped the bike. Everything here is like off camber, so with these street tires you just slip in. All right. The camera doesn't show it, but this is like a 30% gradient. It's incredibly steep even to walk. We'll see. If I try to drive up here, it's going to slip out. So I got to get my tire in this rut here. All right, well, let's see what happens. See, this is where, let me stop for a second. This is where the DCT now is super helpful because I can duck walk through this incredibly ridiculous hill and just go, whoa, holy shit. You see how steep it is? It will slide backwards even with the brakes, both the brakes on. So it allows the bike to very slowly inch up here, find whatever traction, little traction these street tires have, and get through. So it can be a real help if you know how to use it. I feel like there's certain situations where DCT kind of holds you back, and some where it's a real advantage if you know how to use it. So I think I'm going to be able to get up out of here, actually. The fact that the bike can't stall and suddenly tip over is a huge, huge advantage that I didn't have yesterday with that manual bike. Yeah, I really like this. Woo! I'm really digging a trench, but man, so yeah, you got to turn traction control off for this because you need to get power. See, I can just keep my left hand on the grip and not have to worry about the clutch. Success! So, wow, overall I found that to be a huge benefit to getting out of that sticky situation. Okay, let's put the adventure sports on our kind of twisty mountain road here. I'm going to start off in sport mode 2. I kind of like that for more aggressive, twisty pavement riding. And I'll kind of show you how the DCT works. I mean, DCT still sometimes might put you in a lower gear than you might run if you were running a manual. And if that's the case, you just click this button and override it, or you just start using a different mode. So I'm in tour mode, which means I have a sharp throttle response, and then I firmed up the suspension for kind of this twisty road. So you. Is so effortless, and the handling is phenomenal on this. The road holding and handling on the road is definitely better when the adventure sports. Now, I don't know if you notice what I'm doing, but oops, wrong way. I'm running it in an automatic mode instead of manual, but occasionally I will click a button to change up or down a gear, just depending on what what the corner entry or exit is, because at the end of the day, the DCT can't see up ahead the road. But for everybody who argues, oh well, I want manual control, well, you still have manual control. Either you can override the automatic, or you can just put it like this into manual frickin' mode, and then now I'm just in second gear, so I can shift gears on my own. I want to go down to first gear. There we go. So that's me shifting with the buttons. Shifting with the buttons is ergonomically superior. It's like, from a control point of view, this is better than a foot shifter, because your hand's already on the handlebar. You don't have to move your foot up and down off the foot pay. You can keep your foot where you want, and then you just control here. It's really quite easy to use, and the gear shifts are lightning fast and smooth. There's no jarring involved, and this is really good for people who carry a passenger. Wow. Yeah, it's very hard to argue against this dual clutch when you're in any sort of road riding, in my opinion. So I'm still in manual mode, so now I can go back to sport 2, or if I want to cruise, I can go back into drive. So let me just show you, let me do this. Drive mode is much improved for 2024. So if I take off at a moderate pace in drive mode, here's how it's going to shift. See, now that's pretty good. That's kind of a normal, regular person shifting in drive mode, so they've really fixed that. And then you have sport mode, you have manual mode, you have override, so you really get everything. But overall, as a road-going motorcycle, the Adventure Sports is better than the standard bike by a pretty big margin. So if that's what you're wondering, there's your answer. Okay, let me do full acceleration in sport mode 3. See, now I don't know why it does this, but even in sport 3, it will shift from first to second, and sometimes second to third. It won't go all the way to red line. So if you're in an actual race, I mean, you're still going to beat a manual transmission, because you don't have clutch, you don't lose time to the shifting. But if you're in an actual race, put it in manual mode and shift with the buttons, and wait till red line to shift if you really need to get the most speed out of it that you can.
All right, just a quick summary of the pros and cons to the Africa Twins. All right, and I'll point out if it only applies to one or the other. So for me, the pros, I think they look amazing. Some of the, probably, in my opinion, the best looking adventure bikes. Reliability, Honda reliability is proven. I don't really have to say that. The natural feeling and the off-road ability. So what I mean is that it feels natural to ride this off-road. When I ride something like a big GS off-road, a big BMW GS, it's capable, but it feels a bit awkward. These don't have that. These feel like if you took a dirt bike and just blew it up to like twice normal size, feels more like that, if that makes sense. The exhaust sound, I think the engines and the exhaust sound wonderful on these bikes, really nice. Mid-range power and torque is very, very good. The electronics are very customizable and you get a lot of control of various parameters. So in that regard, I like the electronics. Electronic suspension is another pro. The fact that we have conventional suspension with electronic control for preload and damping in different modes is fantastic, because on an adventure bike, the terrain changes and it's great to be able to change your suspension just by clicking a button. The dual clutch transmission, I mean, what a wonderful feature, and only Honda has this right now. Ground clearance. The bikes have really good ground clearance for what they are. What are the downsides? So for me, they feel a bit top heavy. The standard bike feels slightly more top heavy than the Adventure Sports, despite the fact that this one's heavier. I've kind of shown that by now. They do feel a little heavy and a little top heavy compared to some other bikes. I don't think it's any worse than like a Tiger 900 or a, what else? Maybe even a 900 GS. I don't think it's any worse than that. But it doesn't have the low center of gravity feeling that you get maybe on a Touareg or a KTM 890. The seats. I think the seats are still a little bit uncomfortable. The screen boot time. So the time to boot up the TFT is a little bit slow. The ABS and wheelie control resetting. So yeah, when you key the bike on and off, and that the traction control, it's the traction control, the wheelie control, and the ABS. They will all reset and turn themselves back on, which is very frustrating and in some cases even dangerous when you're trying to ride in a dirt and all that stuff comes back on and you're not expecting it and you have to turn it off every single time. Very annoying. Also well, I'm going to skip this one. And then the final one is the engine heat. So the bikes kind of roast your legs. There are worse bikes, V-Strom 800, I'm looking at you. But you will, in the summertime, you will notice your legs getting pretty toasty, and that's something that's kind of a downer. All right, what other bikes should you be looking at if you're looking at an Africa Twin? So I'm going to throw a chart up here on the screen. It's probably going to take up the whole screen. Let's talk about this. So both Africa Twin versions I've got here on the chart. Tiger 900, the Ducati Desert X, KTM 890 Adventure R with the Tech Pack. And then I think you also might be looking maybe at the Touareg 660. All right, so what are the differences really? Now, why don't I have bigger bikes like a Tiger 1200 or a KTM 1290 or an R1300 GS on here? Well, one is the price point. Like with the Africa Twin starting under $15,000, those bikes are kind of in another price category, maybe starting more up towards 20 to 25 and going up from there. The Africa Twin is in an interesting place where it sits a little bit in terms of pricing and weight, a little bit in between those really big adventure bikes and more of the mid-sized bikes like your Touaregs and your T7s and things like that. Kind of sits in the middle, kind of similar to like a Tiger 900, I suppose. From a value perspective, there are two bikes on this chart that I think are standouts. The Touareg is by far the best value. It just is. The Touareg is the bike on this list that I would purchase. Now, that being said, the Africa Twin, for everything you get for the money, for under $15,000 for the base model, that's very, very good value if you look at how this bike stacks up to everything else. The most powerful bike on this list is the Ducati. That's also the most expensive bike on this list, of course. Torque, the Africa Twin has an advantage in torque because it's an 1100cc engine, but it's not quite as heavy or expensive as those bigger adventure bikes. It's got that big torque advantage on the main competitors that I'm showing here. So, 83 foot-pounds of torque versus 65 or 70, or in the Aprilia's case, only 52 because you've got that smaller engine. The weight, you can see the weights. I mean, there's kind of three, like, ways that these bikes break out. So in my mind, you have the 450-pound bikes like a T7, a Touareg, an 890's kind of in that range. And then you jump up to like the 500-pound bikes like the Africa Twins and the Tiger 900s. And then you go up to like 550 with the 1290s and the big GSs. So those are kind of your three steps that I see. In my just very casual opinion, they all are really heavy and big, no matter which one you get. And they're not dirt bikes. You can look at the fuel range. I mean, the standard equipment, the Tiger gives you so much standard equipment, the Tiger 900. I mean, you get almost everything comes with it. So that's part of that higher price point. Whereas if you buy like the Space Africa Twin, if you want to add heated grips and crash bars and a center stand and a better skid plate and all that stuff, it really starts to add up. So maintenance is better on like the KTM is probably the easiest to maintain, and the Aprilia because they have air filters that are right under, just very easy places to get to. The Tiger's also pretty easy as well. And then the scoring. So I did put a score on these bikes, and these scores are always subject to change. There's the reason that so it's out of a potential 40 points, they all get around 30 to 31 points. The reason they all seem to be tied is that each of the bikes on this list do some things really well, others not as good, but everything kind of balances out in the end. So like for me, the Africa Twin's kind of a good all-rounder. The Tiger, because of its sharp rake angle, the steep rake angle, it's not the best off-road. Don't ever trust that front end, but as a road bike, it's really, really good. And then it's a lot of fun and it's comfortable. Something like a KTM 890, amazing off-road, not a very good street bike though, not a very good road bike, not comfortable, but it is a lot of fun. Now the Touareg gets, very high scores across the board. And if you look at the price point for how good that bike is, it's pretty phenomenal. So that's my comparison kind of segment for the Africa Twin. I think if I was buying, and this isn't really part of the review because it's just my opinion as a rider, if I was going to spend around 12 to 15,000 on a mid to full-size adventure bike, I mean, I've owned them all pretty much. The Africa Twin is really high on my list, but if I'm going to do a lot of off-road, see, here's the thing. If I'm going to do mostly road riding, I'm going to get a KTM 1290S or a 1300 GS or something like that, or maybe even a more road-oriented bike. If I'm going to do a lot of off-road, then I want that Touareg or I want that 890R. So the Africa Twin for me, even though I love them to death and they're great, it slides a little bit kind of in between those categories. So it's a good jack of all trades, but it's not really the best in terms of off-road or the best in terms of on-road. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't know that I would buy the Africa Twin if for me personally in this kind of price range and category. But it all depends on what you're doing with the bike. Do you value the Honda nameplate, the reliability that comes with Honda? Do you like the way they look? Do the features meet your need? Are you tall enough? Budget, all those things. And you eventually have to make your own decision. I will say this, Africa Twins are incredible bikes, and you're not going to regret your decision. They stack up very well to the competition, and it's really hard to split these apart in terms of which one you should get. A big controversial question, should you get a dual clutch transmission or a manual? I'm not going to spend too long on this because I really can't tell you what's best for you. I've showed you how the manual works. I've showed you how the DCT works and the distinct advantages that each one has. They're both great. I love that we have the option. Now let me put on my motorcyclist hat and take off the journalist hat, being a little less objective. If I want to be more personal, more subjective, this is the first time I've really had for a month to jump back and forth between the dual clutch and the manual. And because I've had that opportunity to jump between them and do all the same roads and trails on both, I can tell you, for me, it's the dual clutch, hands down, no contest. The reason for that is I still have manual control when I want it or when I need it, but I have those incredible advantages of the dual clutch when that's something that I want to have or when that's something I want to use. There's a small weight penalty, don't really notice it. There's a small price penalty, $800. I mean, whatever in the scheme of things, right, of your life. So for me, it's dual clutch. Now, why have all my Africa Twins that I've owned been manuals? Is because I was scared to get the dual clutch because it's new and I don't know if I'm going to like it. And when it came down time to buy my own Africa Twins in the past, I've had 3 of them, I always got the manual because I just wasn't sure if I'd like the DCT. I finally now had enough time to learn it, to appreciate it, and the DCT is better for me. I think it's probably better for most adventure riders, but ultimately that's up to you. All right, final thoughts on the 2024 Africa Twins. These are sensational motorcycles, just phenomenal. Very, very few downsides, and we've covered what those are. The improvements that Honda has done for 2024, adding equipment to the base model, improving the dual clutch transmissions, improving the handling of the adventure sports, getting that seat height down, lowering the center of gravity. All the changes they've done are great. Really meaningful updates. Really, really nice. Now, I promised I was going to tell you at the end which version I would buy for myself. Keep in mind that it's just me. It's just my personal preference. I'm not saying it's better, but I would get the adventure sports. Why? It handles better. It's easier to reach the ground. It feels lighter despite being heavier. It has more standard features that I don't have to worry about trying to add. I like the increased wind protection. I like the increased fuel range. I want the electronic suspension. I really like it, and I can't get it on the standard model. So for all these reasons, I would definitely have to go with the adventure sports if I was buying an Africa Twin today. All right, well, I hope you've enjoyed this review. I know it was a long one. Thank you for sticking in there. If you have questions, concerns, put that down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Please consider supporting independent journalism here at Big Rock Moto. There's ways to do that in the pinned comment and description below. Beyond that, thank you so much for watching. Ride safe, and I'll see you out there.